Before we begin this journey into one of history's most haunting mysteries, take a moment to like this video if you find it valuable, and subscribe if you'd like more stories like this. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see our community spread across the world. Now, dim the lights, set your volume low, and let's descend together into the frozen heart of a mystery that has never been solved. In the thin air of the northern Urals, where winter is not a season but a way of being, silence has a weight. It presses against the skin, fills the lungs, and makes every breath deliberate. It was in this vast white stillness that a young university student named Mikhail Sharavin stood on February 26, 1959, staring at something that should not have been there. A corner of canvas, orange against the endless snow. Sharavin was part of a search party, one of several teams combing the frozen slopes for 9 missing hikers who had failed to return from their expedition. The trek was supposed to have been routine, a challenging but manageable journey through one of the most remote regions of the Soviet Union. When the Hikers Sports Club in Sverdlovsk hadn't received the expected telegram by February 20th, concern turned to alarm. Now, nearly a month after the group had last been seen, the search was on. The tent emerged from the snow, like a wound in the landscape. As the rescuers approached, they saw that it had been partially buried, collapsed beneath the weight of accumulated snowfall. But it was the state of the tent itself that made them stop, that made the cold seem suddenly colder. The canvas had been slashed open from the inside, long deliberate cuts made by someone desperate to escape. Around the tent, the searchers found supplies that should have been precious in this environment: food, warm clothing, boots. A flask of vodka sat untouched. A plate of white pork fat, called salo, remained where it had been left. Most disturbing were the footprints leading away from the campsite. 8 or 9 sets of tracks, many clearly made by bare feet or feet clad only in socks. Some showed the imprint of a single shoe. They led down the slope toward the tree line more than a kilometer away before disappearing into the forest's embrace. The mountain where this tent stood has a name in the language of the indigenous Mansi people who have lived in these regions for centuries. They call it Kholat Shakal. In their tongue, it means dead mountain. Later, the pass itself would be renamed in memory of the expedition's young leader, and the world would come to know this place by a different designation: Dyatlov Pass. What the search party found in the following days and weeks would transform a tragic mountaineering accident into one of the 20th century's most enduring mysteries. 9 young people, all experienced hikers, all found dead under circumstances that defied easy explanation. Some appeared to have frozen to death, their bodies scattered in the snow. Others bore injuries so severe that the examining physician would compare them to the trauma of a car crash. One young woman was found missing her tongue and both eyes. The official Soviet investigation, conducted hurriedly in the spring of that year, would conclude that the hikers had died from what they termed a compelling natural force. The case was closed by May, the files sealed and sent to a secret archive. But closing a file does not close a mystery, and the questions that began that February day on the slopes of Dead Mountain have echoed through more than 6 decades, refusing to be silenced by official pronouncements or the passage of time. This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass incident, a tale of ambition and tragedy, of the thin line between adventure and disaster, and of the stubborn human need to understand what happened in the darkness of that winter night. It begins, as all such stories must, with the living, with 9 souls full of hope and confidence, setting out into the vast white wilderness of the Ural Mountains. Section 2. The journey begins. In January of 1959, in the industrial city of Sverdlovsk, deep in the heart of the Soviet Union, a young man named Igor Alexeyevich Dyatlov was making final preparations for an expedition. At 23, Dyatlov was a 5th-year student at the Ural Polytechnical Institute, studying radio engineering in a nation that was racing toward a technological future. But like many young Soviets of his generation, he harbored a passion that existed outside the lecture halls and laboratories. He loved the mountains. Dyatlov was an experienced hiker and skier, certified at the highest level available in the Soviet Union at that time. A Category 3 trek required participants to traverse at least 300 kilometers through difficult terrain, often in harsh winter conditions. It was not an undertaking for the casual outdoorsman. The planning, the physical conditioning, the technical skill required, all of it demanded respect for the mountains and an understanding of their power. For this expedition, Dyatlov assembled a group of 8 companions, most of them fellow students from the institute. There was Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, one of 2 young women on the trek; Rustem Slobodin, also 23, known for his wit and his strength; Yuri Yudin, the same age, who had made several previous expeditions with Dyatlov; the 2 Yuris who would never return, Yuri Doroshenko, 21, and Georgy Krivonischenko, 23, who had previously worked at a secret nuclear facility, helping to clean up a radioactive contamination incident. The other young woman was Lyudmila Dubinina, just 20 years old, studying engineering economics. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, also 23, brought a touch of French heritage to the group through his grandfather, though he was fully Russian by upbringing and culture. Alexander Kolevatov, 24, was the quiet one, methodical and careful. The oldest member of the group joined them at the last minute, and his presence would later fuel much speculation. Semyon Zolotaryov was 37, a World War II veteran with a mysterious past. Some accounts suggest he was added to satisfy Soviet requirements that expeditions include a senior member. Others have wondered at deeper reasons for his participation. What is known is that he brought his camera, a detail that would prove significant in the weeks to come. Their route was ambitious. They would traverse the northern Urals, moving through some of the most remote territory in the Sverdlovsk Oblast. Their ultimate destination was Mount Otorten, whose name means "don't go there" in the Mansi language. The goal was to cover approximately 300 kilometers over 16 days, navigating through deep snow, sub-zero temperatures, and the kind of isolation that most people in the modern world can scarcely imagine. On January 23, 1959, the group departed Sverdlovsk. The route they followed was logged in an official route book, standard procedure for Soviet hiking expeditions. The plan was straightforward. They would travel north by train and truck to the small settlement of Vizhai, then begin their skiing trek into the wilderness. Upon completion, they would send a telegram to their sports club confirming their safe return. That telegram was expected no later than February 12th. The first days of the journey proceeded without incident. The group moved through snow-covered forests and over frozen rivers, their spirits high despite the brutal cold. They cached supplies along the way, food and equipment they would collect on the return journey, lightening their loads for the push toward Otorten. On January 28th, Yuri Yudin made a decision that would save his life. Suffering from sciatica and aching joints, he turned back, leaving his 8 companions to continue without him. He was the last person outside the group to see them alive. Years later, Yudin would recall saying goodbye to his friends, watching them disappear into the white landscape. He would spend the rest of his life haunted by the what-ifs, by the narrow margin that separated his survival from their deaths. The group continued north, their progress documented in diaries and on film. The photographs they took show young people in good spirits, laughing in the snow, working together to break trail and set up camps. They appear confident, capable, aware of the challenges, but not daunted by them. On February 1st, they began ascending the slopes toward the pass that would carry them over to the other side of the ridge. Weather conditions deteriorated. A snowstorm reduced visibility. In the diary entries recovered later, there is mention of strong winds and difficulty maintaining direction. Based on the evidence found at the site, investigators would later piece together what likely happened next. Instead of crossing the pass as planned, the group appears to have veered west, climbing up the slope of Kolatsyakl itself. Whether this was intentional, an attempt to maintain altitude in difficult conditions, or an error caused by poor visibility, has never been definitively established. What is known is that as daylight faded on February 1st, Igor Dyatlov made the decision to make camp on the exposed slope of the mountain, rather than descending to the shelter of the forest below. They dug into the snow, cutting a flat platform into the slope to provide a stable base for their tent. This was standard practice in winter mountaineering. They pitched their tent, cooked their evening meal, and prepared to settle in for the night. The last photograph on Krivonishenko's camera, taken around 5 in the afternoon, shows the group working on the tent, the sky already darkening behind them. What happened next, in the hours between that last photograph and the terrible flight from the tent, remains one of the great unknowns at the heart of this mystery. The tent stood alone on the mountainside, a fragile membrane between warmth and killing cold. Inside, 9 people lay in their sleeping bags, their bodies the only source of heat. Historical weather records indicate that on the night of February 1st, temperatures dropped to at least -25 degrees Celsius, perhaps colder. Strong winds would have made the effective temperature even more brutal. The hikers were not unprepared. They had warm sleeping bags, layers of clothing, collective body heat. They had food, fuel for a stove. They had everything necessary to survive the night, provided they stayed in their shelter. But something happened, something that made them abandon everything. The tent was slashed open from the inside, not torn by wind, but deliberately cut by knives, wielded by people who needed to get out immediately. Long cuts in the canvas, made by hands that were either panicked or utterly determined. And then they fled, down the slope, away from their supplies and warm clothing, out into temperatures that could kill an inadequately dressed person in minutes. The footprints told a stark story. Most of the group left wearing whatever they had been sleeping in. Some were barefoot. Others wore a single shoe, or just socks. Given that these were experienced winter hikers who understood the dangers of cold exposure, this behavior suggests something extraordinary happened. What could cause such panic? What force, could compel people to flee into certain death rather than remain in their shelter. The footprints showed that the group stayed together initially, moving as a unit down the slope toward the tree line. They were walking, not running in disorder. This suggests that whatever drove them from the tent had passed, or that they believed they had moved to safety. At the tree line, about 1.5 kilometers from the tent, they stopped beneath a large cedar tree. Here, they attempted to make a fire. Broken branches found at the scene showed they had tried to burn the cedar's lower limbs. Some branches were as high as 5 meters off the ground, suggesting people had climbed the tree, perhaps to gather fuel or to look back toward their tent. They succeeded in creating a small fire, though it provided little warmth against the killing cold. It was at this cedar tree that the first 2 bodies would be found. Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko lay beneath the tree's branches, both partially undressed. In the unforgiving logic of hypothermia, this made terrible sense. As the body's core temperature drops, the brain malfunctions. In late stages of freezing, victims often experience a sensation of intense heat, leading them to remove their clothing. This is called paradoxical undressing. But not all of the group stayed at the cedar. Some attempted to return to the tent. 3 members, Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin, began climbing back up the slope. They were found at intervals, each having made it a little farther before the cold claimed them. Dyatlov was found less than a kilometer from the tent, his hands raised as if shielding his face. The other 4 moved in a different direction. They went deeper into the forest, about 75 meters from the cedar tree. There, in a ravine near a small stream, they attempted something more sophisticated. They dug into the snow, creating a makeshift snow den that could have protected them from wind. Branches and clothing were laid down for insulation. It was a rational action, the kind of survival measure experienced winter travelers might take when caught without proper shelter. But for these 4, the den became a tomb. The search for the missing hikers began on February 20th. Initially, it was assumed this would be a rescue mission. The group was experienced and well-equipped. The first search parties consisted of volunteer students and faculty from the Polytechnical Institute, people who knew the victims. On February 26th, when Mikhail Sharavin and his team found the tent, hope began to fade. The condition of the tent, the abandoned supplies, the tracks leading away, all suggested tragedy. The search expanded, with military and police units joining. The first body was found on February 27th. It was Yuri Doroshenko, lying beneath the cedar tree, partially undressed. Beside him was Georgy Krivonishenko, in a similar state. Both had burns on their hands and feet, consistent with trying to warm themselves at a fire. 2 young men, separated from their shelter in brutal cold, had tried to save themselves and failed. Over the next few days, 3 more bodies were discovered. On March 2nd, search parties found Igor Dyatlov about 300 meters from the tent, face down in the snow. The next day, Zinaida Kolmogorova was found, and on March 5th, Rustem Slobodin. All 3 were positioned in a line between the cedar tree and the tent, as if trying to return to their shelter when the cold overwhelmed them. These 5 appeared to have died of hypothermia, though autopsies would reveal troubling details. Slobodin had a small fracture in his skull. Kolmogorova had unusual bruising. Dyatlov had been vomiting blood. Krivonishenko had bitten off a piece of his own knuckle, and both he and Doroshenko had burns that couldn't have occurred if they had simply fallen asleep. The investigation was treating the incident as a tragic accident. Young hikers, caught in bad weather, had made poor decisions. The strange details were noted, but not yet seen as evidence of something sinister. Then came May, and the discovery of the final 4 bodies. As spring arrived and deep snows melted, an indigenous Mansi hunter named Kurikov was traveling through the area with his dog. The animal led Kurikov to a discovery that would transform the investigation: a crude shelter in a ravine near a small stream. Inside and around this shelter were the remaining 4 members of the Dyatlov group. The bodies were examined by forensic pathologist Boris Vozrojdeny on May 9th. What he found challenged every assumption about how these people had died. Lyudmila Dubinina had suffered massive trauma to her chest. Her ribs were broken, multiple fractures that had caused extensive internal bleeding. Most disturbing, her tongue was missing, along with soft tissue of her mouth and eyes. Semyon Zolotaryov also had severe rib fractures and was missing his eyes. Nikolai Thibault Brignol's skull was fractured, a major injury that would have caused intense trauma. The forensic pathologist was clear. These injuries were not caused by human violence. The force required was too great, comparable to a car crash. Yet there were no external wounds, no bruising consistent with being struck. The damage was internal, massive, and inexplicable. Adding to the mystery, some clothing worn by these 4 was found to be radioactive. Not dangerously so, but measurably above background levels. The official investigation concluded in May with a finding that satisfied no one. The hikers had died from a compelling natural force. The case was closed due to the absence of a guilty party, and the files were sealed in a secret archive. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Dyatlov Pass case files became public. Photographs taken by the hikers themselves, autopsy reports in clinical detail, testimony from search parties and investigators. The release of these materials did not solve the mystery. It deepened it. The more people studied the evidence, the more questions arose. In the absence of official answers, theories proliferated. One early theory focused on the indigenous Mansi people. Could the hikers have violated sacred ground, leading to confrontation? This theory gained little traction. The Mansi were not known to be hostile, and forensic evidence argued against human attack. The injuries were too severe. As pathologist Vozrojdeny noted, no human could have delivered such blows. More persistent was the theory of military involvement. The Soviet Union in 1959 was deep in the Cold War, racing to develop nuclear weapons. The Ural region was home to secret facilities. Could the Dyatlov group have stumbled into a military test zone? The radioactive contamination seemed to support this, as did the government's quick closure of the case. Proponents point to Georgy Krivonishenko's previous work at the Kishtim nuclear facility, where a major accident in 1957 had contaminated a vast area. They note Semyon Zolotaryov's mysterious background. Some suggest the hikers witnessed a missile test or were exposed to chemical weapons. But this theory faces challenges. If the military was involved, why were the bodies left where they were? Why conduct an investigation at all? The radioactivity on clothing was low level and could be explained by Krivonishenko's previous exposure. His clothes, borrowed by others in desperate attempts to stay warm, would have carried that contamination. More exotic theories emerged. Some claimed the hikers encountered a Yeti. Others suggested UFOs or alien encounter, pointing to reports of strange lights in the sky. Tabloids proposed everything from secret Soviet sonic weapons to paranormal phenomena. These theories offer little verifiable evidence. They rely on speculation rather than systematic analysis. Yet they persist because they offer explanatory power for elements that seem most inexplicable: the sudden panic, the severe internal injuries. The most scientifically grounded theories focused on natural phenomena. Could an avalanche have struck the tent? This theory was suggested early, but dismissed because the slope angle was considered too gentle and there was no avalanche debris. Another natural explanation suggested infrasound. Low-frequency sound waves generated by strong winds. Studies have shown that infrasound can cause feelings of panic and anxiety in humans. Could such waves have panicked the hikers, causing them to flee in an irrational state? For more than 50 years, the mystery seemed unsolvable. Then, in 2019, something changed. The Russian government announced it would reopen the investigation. The reopened Russian investigation in 2019 took a fresh approach. Andrei Kuryakov, deputy head of the regional prosecutor's office, brought modern forensic techniques and willingness to challenge old assumptions. Kuryakov and his team focused on the avalanche hypothesis, which had been dismissed in 1959 but never entirely abandoned. They recognized that earlier investigators had limited understanding of how snow behaves. Not all avalanches are massive walls of snow. A slab avalanche, where a layer of compacted snow breaks away and slides as a coherent mass, can occur on gentler slopes and leave minimal traces. The theory they developed: the hikers had cut into the slope to create a flat platform for their tent. This cut, combined with irregular topography and accumulation of wind-blown snow above the campsite, created unstable conditions. Several hours after the tent was erected, a slab of compacted snow released and slid down over the tent. The avalanche was small but violent enough to cause injuries to some sleeping hikers and terrify the entire group. Fearing a larger avalanche might follow and unable to safely remain near their damaged tent in zero visibility conditions, the hikers made the fatal decision to descend to the tree line. They believed they were moving to safety, that they could wait out the night and return to supplies in the morning. But the brutal cold had other plans. The hypothesis suggested that some who had been directly struck by the avalanche sustained serious but not immediately fatal injuries. Others were uninjured but inadequately clothed. The attempt to build a fire at the cedar tree was a desperate effort to survive. When that proved insufficient, the most injured members were moved to the ravine where the snow den was constructed. A second, small collapse of snow, or perhaps a fall in difficult terrain, could have caused additional trauma. In 2020, the Russian investigation officially concluded that an avalanche was the most probable cause. This finding was controversial. Many who had studied the case remained skeptical. But then, science offered new support. In 2021, two scientists from Swiss universities, Johann Gaum and Alexander Puzrin, published a study in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment. Using advanced computer modeling and historical weather data, they demonstrated how a delayed slab avalanche could indeed have occurred on the Dyatlov Pass slope. Their work addressed each main objection. The slope angle was actually steeper than it appeared due to irregular topography obscured by snow. The time delay between setting up camp and the avalanche could be explained by gradual accumulation of wind-transported snow above the tent, a process that would take several hours. Most intriguingly, they tackled the question of injuries. Using data from automotive crash tests from the 1970s, where researchers studied effects of impacts on human bodies to improve vehicle safety. Gomez and Buzrin showed that a slab of compacted snow falling on sleeping people could cause exactly the kind of internal trauma seen in the ravine victims: severe rib fractures and skull damage with minimal external bruising. The study was careful not to claim it had definitively solved the mystery. As Gomez told reporters, no one survived to tell the story, so absolute certainty is impossible. But the research demonstrated, for the first time with rigorous scientific modeling, that an avalanche hypothesis could account for major elements: the sudden flight from the tent, the severe injuries, the lack of obvious avalanche debris. Not everyone was convinced. Critics pointed out that even the sophisticated avalanche theory struggled to explain certain details. If an avalanche struck the tent, why did hikers cut their way out rather than leave through the entrance? Why did they not return later when danger had passed? More than 60 years have passed since that night on Kholat Syakhl. The tent is long gone. The snow that fell that February has melted and refrozen thousands of times. The mountain, indifferent to human tragedy, continues its slow dance with the seasons. A memorial now stands near the site, a rock formation dedicated to the 9 young people who died there. The bodies were returned to Sverdlovsk and buried with honors. Their funerals were attended.